The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Sarah Jaffee on the return of the strike. Marc Dann asks if working-class voters can trust the Democrats. Plus, Bill Press with Norman Ornstein on paralysis in Washington and why Republicans are the problem. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Workers at GM recently ended the longest auto workers strike in 50 years. Sarah Jaffee says the action signals a revival of picket line politics with a message that is bigger than any one union. And we say hello to Sarah Jaffee, author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, and a Type Media Institute reporting fellow, an independent journalist covering labor, economic justice, social movements, politics, gender, and pop culture. She's also the co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast, as well as a columnist at the Progressive and New Labor Forum. Sarah Jaffee, what do you do in the afternoons?
Oh, in my spare time, I cover UK politics just for funsies.
Oh, my goodness. Well, listen, appreciate you taking the time to join us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you recently wrote a piece for the Progressive titled Return of the Strike. At the time you wrote it, the GM Auto Workers strike was already the longest in decades at an American auto manufacturer. And you admitted you were surprised. Why surprised?
Well, when I talked to people who were in the UAW, people had not really gotten the sense that there was a lot of preparation going on for a strike. And, the longest strikes at private sector entities in recent years, let alone like at an auto manufacturer, have been, a week or so. In the case of the UAW, it has been like a couple of days. And so to see them go this long without a real sense that they've been getting prepared for this, a real sense that they were building to this moment, which we'll talk about when we get to the Chicago Teachers Union, I'm sure, the willingness to sustain this strike was really just from a rank-and-file membership that were so tired of conceding over and over again to this, multi-billion-dollar company that had been bailed out with their tax dollars and with their willingness to make concessions in the hard times.
Well, and the piece offers a short history of workers' strikes in the United States, and you remind us of the chilling effect of the 1981 PATCO strike. And to remind our listeners, that's the air traffic controllers, when Ronald Reagan fired over 11,000 workers. What was the takeaway for other workers and union members?
Yeah, Reagan really declared open season on the labor movement with the PATCO attack. It was very much the equivalent of Margaret Thatcher's attack on the miners in the UK. And what we saw in both of those moments was an attempt by these administrations to say that we are on the side of capital in these fights, even when they are technically public sector workers. We are going to be on the side of making money, of these industries continuing to function, and workers not having any say in the conditions of their labor. And so if you look at strike frequency charts up until 1981, and then the just serious drop-off. We're not anywhere near where we were before 1981, and yet everybody is looking around calling this a massive strike wave. So just to give people an idea of how much further we have to go, we're still an order of magnitude behind where we were in the early 80s, and that was nothing compared to, several strike waves ago, the strike wave that built the CIO in the 30s and 40s, and the strike waves, after World War II. So we're still in a moment where labor has been, like I said, has been conceding defeat sort of over and over again. So to see things like this, the strike at GM, the strikes in a variety of places around the country, and to see the strike waves being led more and more often by teachers, nurses, other caring workers is a real change.
Mm-hmm. You also identify a shift in 2012. You mentioned the Chicago teachers strike. We'll talk about one first and then the other. But the shift in 2012 when the Chicago teachers staged the strike, what was significant about this moment?
So many things were significant about that moment. I sort of, this is the hobby horse that I will not get off of, that we have to talk about the CTU in 2012 whenever we talk about the change in strikes. If there was a moment, if 1981 and PATCO was a moment, 2012 in Chicago was also a moment when labor started to say, actually, we can do this again. And it's really significant that it was public sector workers, that it was teachers. It was in a city with a Democratic mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who was fresh out of the Obama administration at the time, with a state legislature that had passed a law that said that teachers could only strike over wages and working conditions. And the teachers just kind of looked at that and said, no, we're going to do this differently. What they did was they built into their union. They had a radical caucus that took over to reform the union in 2010. They did things like invest money in an organizing department, in organizing in the community, as well as internally organizing the members to feel like they were, again, active part of the union. And they prepared to say, we might have to go on strike to get what they wrote. They wrote this famous report, The Schools Chicago Students Deserve. And so by the time they struck in 2012, they had done the groundwork so that people in the community understood that when teachers were going on strike, they were going on strike over working conditions that were also their students' learning conditions. And after the 2012 strike, teachers unions around the country learned this from Chicago. They worked with Chicago teachers. Chicago teachers were doing speaking tours everywhere. They replicated this model, putting out these reports for the school St. Paul students deserve, the school Seattle students deserve, the schools Newton, Massachusetts students deserve, all over the country. And they ran people to take over the unions and to change the way the unions operated in places like the Massachusetts Teachers Association, when Barbara Mataloni ran, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in Portland, Oregon, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, which also had a massive, significant strike this year. They replicated this model of saying that the bargaining that we do as public employees is actually for the good of everyone. We now call it bargaining for the common good, which is like an actual strategic plan that people actually study and think about. How can we bring common good issues to our bargaining table where we have the leverage of being able to, once again, go on strike?
It's not just about us. It's about it's a much bigger picture. I mean, I think that's the big message that comes through from that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really significant to say that our strikes are not just for us. They're for the entire working class of some place like Chicago. So when the teachers went out again this year, it's the same thing, right? The parents, the community, the students themselves who march with their teachers know that what their teachers are fighting for is better conditions for them. So when this year in Chicago, one of their key demands was extra resources for homeless students. There are 17,000 homeless students in Chicago public schools. We should just pause and think about that number for a minute, because that's ridiculous. And so the teachers said, when we have students who don't even have a secure place to sleep at night, the idea that we're responsible for teaching them things that they are going to be tested on is ludicrous, right? These kids are not being taken care of at the most basic level. And so in this strike, they won extra funding to hire to hire counselors, to hire professionals who can actually help make sure that homeless students are getting the basic needs taken care of, to actually put this in the schools and say that these things are intimately connected, that the housing crisis is an education crisis, is really unprecedented in American labor unions and probably around the world, I would guess.
Absolutely, yeah. We're speaking with Sarah Jaffee, author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. She's also co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast. Sarah, this example Chicago teachers have made by linking their action to issues much broader than their own paycheck, as we talk about, is this an approach that you expect to see extend into other sectors of the labor movement? Yeah,
absolutely. So people have taken up this framework of bargaining for the common good and really tried to apply it in different ways. So, nurses, for example, one of the big demands of nursing unions is often what they call safe staffing levels, which is nurse-to-patient ratios that are smaller. So you get better care if the nurse who's looking after you is only looking after one or two other people rather than 5 or 6. Right, so that's a key tactic or a key bargaining item for nurses unions a lot of the time. And this is similar. The New York State Nurses Association really came to the point of almost going on strike recently around the staffing issue. And this is one that, again, that the working conditions of these nurses are the caring conditions of their patients. Imagine, when your doctor, your nurse is overworked, things get missed. It's a little bit harder when we're talking about the private sector, when you're talking about, again, the workers at GM, but even the workers at, the UAW members that I spoke to who are on strike are very aware that the United Auto Workers built the middle class in this country, right? That when unions were strong, even non-union workplaces set wages and benefits at competitive levels with the unionized ones in order, often to just prevent their workplace from going union. But that kind of power, it always goes beyond a specific workplace. And when we're thinking about some of these key political demands that we're hearing in this presidential election, something like Medicare for All that Bernie Sanders and now Elizabeth Warren are behind, think about what it would look like for big unions to put a lot of weight into fighting for Medicare for All, which would, A, it would help all of us, but B, it would take this key issue that employers are always trying to get concessions on, right? Employers are always trying to get workers to pay more of their own health insurance in this country.
Sure.
So if you actually just take that off the bargaining table, Sarah Nelson from at the Flight Attendants Association talks about this, right? Then you actually have more time and space to think about the other things you can win because your employer is no longer paying your health insurance. So what does that look like in terms of raises that you could win? But it is still also an issue that would help people who don't have jobs or who have jobs that have never provided them with health insurance. So things like this, I think we really have to start thinking about in terms of big universal demands. What would a demand for shorter working hours look like? In the case of some of the auto workers, they've talked a lot about these plant closures. So I spent some time in Lordstown, Ohio last spring, where they had shut down the famous auto plant. And this was one of the issues that the UAW was trying to bargain around, was trying to keep these plants open or get new production in them. Because again, when this plant closes, that has a huge effect on the entire community, right? Lordstown is right outside of Youngstown. Youngstown has already been devastated by the closure of the steel mills. And, no matter what Donald Trump says about his trade wars, it hasn't reopened all the steel mills in Youngstown. So
Right.
Losing the auto plant, which is one of the last sources of good jobs, right, of good $25, $26 an hour union jobs with decent benefits, when that goes and, over 1,000 people lose those jobs, what effect does that have on the community? These are still issues of the common good. The point of leverage is a little bit harder because, you can't, halting production at Lordstown, you can't do it when they've already closed it.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. The systemic effect of
Right.
these things, I think, is well beyond the comprehension of most people. And I think to change the way that these guys are striking and what they're striking for kind of helps open that up for others that aren't involved in it. And,
Exactly.
we just saw the end of the GM strike, longest auto worker strike in 50 years. What's your take on what the UAW was able to accomplish with this strike?
The thing that's frustrating, there was a big campaign to vote no on this contract and to send the bargaining team back in. And, it passed narrowly. It was ratified by the membership because people were frustrated. They thought that they stayed out for 40 days and that that they should have gotten more. One of the key issues other than the plant closures, which they largely couldn't do anything about, was the question of the multi-tier workforce. So we often talk about 2-tier, but really in some place like the GM plants, it's more like 4-tier because there's, the seniority workers, the ones who've been there for a long time, who are at the top pay scale, the best benefits. Then the second tier that the union sort of officially agreed to in 2007 during the bankruptcies. The second tier comes in, does the same work as the first tier for less money, worse benefits. And then there's all these temps, now. And this is a thing in manufacturing more and more, where they have staffing agencies that bring in these workers who, in many cases, temp is not an accurate description for them. They are, once again, often doing the same work as the top tier workers. They're doing it for less money, and they can be fired at any time. And the reason that the companies pay these staffing agencies to do this is a staffing agency takes on the responsibility for things like unemployment payments. So even though in what it costs GM or some other company to employ an outsourcing company, essentially, to then employ its workers, it doesn't cost them all that much less per hour per employee because, the third-party company is taking a cut. But what it does is it ensures that they have a workforce that is ultra-flexible, that they can hire and lay off at any point in time. So one of the demands in this strike was to make all of these workers equal, to say if you do the same work at GM, you should be on the same scale of promotions and raises that the rest of us are on, right?
Mm-hmm.
That should be fair. And they didn't get that. So they got a path to full-time employment for some of the temps after 3 years, but they don't really have any enforcement mechanism to make sure that the company doesn't just lay them all off when they're getting close to 3 years, right?
Now, this is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, and it's a question of really, how much leverage do you have with a strike? The GM lost a lot of money while having its workers out for this long. It loses, it does lose some prestige in the community, right? When people look around and think, hey, this company doesn't do right by all the guys that I know and women, I shouldn't say guys, that work there, then, it does cost them something. But, these are companies now that have production all over the world. A globalized production chain is not as easy to disrupt. So we spoke with Sean Crawford, who is an employee at the Flint truck assembly plant in Flint, Michigan. And he was like, what we have to do as the union is we really have to start thinking globally. How do we actually organize around the world with all of the workers who are making things that go into a GM car, wherever they are? How do we really think about the power that we could have if we were all connected, rather than just the power we have in one place to say, we want to keep this production here rather than have it go to Mexico, rather than have it go, wherever else it might go.
Power's in the numbers, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of the way we've always been brought up. Sarah, as you look around the nation right now, where else do you see budding movements that suggest an empowered workforce ready to take their demands to the picket line?
One of those places, I'm in New York City in the office of Type Media Center. I got to talk about my own industry. Journalists are organizing. Journalists are organizing like crazy. The folks at WHYY, the public radio station in Philadelphia, just unionized. There were big actions at BuzzFeed and, oh my God, what was the other one? I can't remember. Oh, Vox Media, both places where they had really bruising union campaigns, had, staff walkouts, staff days of action recently. And the folks at Deadspin, which was formerly part of Gawker Media, after their bosses told them to stick to sports and fired a well-regarded editor, they all quit and protest together, which is one step further than going on strike, I suppose. Although then, it does free up those jobs for other people to take and stick to sports like the boss said. But it is, it's telling that Gawker Media was one of the first places to unionize in the industry, and that this continues to be a source of action and sort of inspiration for the rest of the industry. What else? There are always continuing rumblings among the workers of the Fight for 15. Home care workers and nurses are always worth watching. And, it's going to be interesting to see what happens sort of leading up to the election, right? Because one of the things we've seen in the last couple years of this, building interest in and willingness to strike is that you can't necessarily tell where it's going to pop up next. So there are probably plenty of things that I'm not even aware of that are bubbling under the surface all over the country.
Which is good because
it is good.
It's been a long time, since before 1981 that, and it's also the important thing too is that the message is different now. As you pointed out, it's not about us. It's a lot bigger a picture than that, and I think that's what's going to bring success to these movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really significant to say that our demands are for everyone, that they are bigger, that when we win, we all win. As the good old arguments say, right? The working class unites. It has nothing to lose but its chains.
Absolutely. Sarah Jaffee, author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, also co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast, joining us today on our podcast, America's Democrats podcast. Sarah, thank you for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, can Democrats become the party of the working class again? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Breaking news, Donald Trump has inadvertently said something true. He recently exulted that his special tax incentives to spur investment in poverty projects has gone, quote, beyond anything that anybody even thought. So true. His Opportunity Zone tax breaks are financing such anti-poverty projects as a super yacht marina on the Tony waterfront of West Palm Beach, Florida. Who would have thought? Named Rybovich, this project is a luxurious resort-style marina that will accommodate the $100 million football field-sized yachts of the super-rich. Not your typical poverty zone. It's being developed by Wayne Huizenga Jr., the politically connected billionaire who inherited a fortune last year from his father, a corporate baron who had owned Blockbuster Video and was a major donor and plutocratic pal of Donald Trump. Father and son were also big-money backers of Rick Scott, the notoriously sleazy Republican governor of Florida who had authority under Trump's Opportunity Zone program to designate which poverty areas were eligible for the multi-million-dollar tax subsidies. Obviously, an opulent super yacht marina does not qualify. But money talks. Huizenga Jr. simply asked his buddy, the governor, to give the tax break to him. And shazam! Scott waved his magic gubernatorial wand and transformed the posh marina into a poverty zone, an area in which Huizenga himself had just bought a $5 million house. The tax subsidy he's been given could cover the cost of that house, but we won't know since Trump's law requires no disclosure of who gets how much of a tax handout. This is Jim Hightower saying, even more disgusting is that slipping in Huizenga's luxury super yacht marina meant that an actual poverty-stricken area in Florida got rejected by the governor. Plutocracy in action.
If you like these feisty pops of populism that Hightower zings out on the airwaves, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter provides the in-depth lowdown on what the greed heads of Wall Street and the boneheads of Washington are doing to us behind the scenes. With Hightower's saucy Texas humor and truth-telling populist perspective, the lowdown literally can lift you up. And get this, you can have the lowdown delivered to your mailbox or email each month for only $15 a year. Yes, 12 issues, only $15. Check it out, hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Democrats have a working class problem, but they still have a chance to fix it. Marc Dann says that has to begin with admitting the betrayals brought on by the last two Democratic administrations. And we say hello to Marc Dann, who served as Attorney General of the state of Ohio and now leads the Dann Law Firm, which specializes in protecting consumers from various forms of predatory financing. Marc Dann, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
And thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Mark, in an article you recently co-wrote with Leo Jennings III, you asked this question: can the working class trust the Democrats? And it's a piece largely about the last two Democratic presidents. So let's begin with President Bill Clinton. How did he betray the working class?
Well, he ran for office promising to make health care available to everybody, and they just completely failed to deliver. He led the effort along with his Treasury Secretary Rubin to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act, which frankly laid the groundwork for the financial crisis of 2008 that hurt working class people in great disproportion to the rest of the country. And he passed that. He fought for and advocated and passed NAFTA, which has demonstrably put thousands of people who worked in manufacturing out of work, or forced them into fields where they weren't trained or capable of, and ended up reducing their quality and their standard of living.
Well, and of course, you make it clear that President Obama didn't do much better by way of the working class, and you write about TARP, which, of course, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. How did this program betray working Americans? Because, when it was sold to us, if you will, it was the silver bullet, practically.
Yeah, well, only a sliver of the money that was appropriated for TARP, and we're talking about billions and billions of dollars, made its way to people who were trying to save their homes. Most of it went into recapitalizing big financial institutions and keeping them from failing, which is, because the folks that were making these decisions were all of Wall Street and of Harvard economics and those kinds of places. It seemed to them to be the much more important task. But really, looking at it from the ground up, it was very difficult for regular working and middle-class Americans who had fallen behind on their mortgage because of the financial crisis to be able to access those funds that were necessary to bring their mortgage current. I'll give you an example. If you wanted to get TARP money in Ohio, you couldn't couple that with a modification of your loan. So what you had to do is under the way the program was structured, if you were behind, the program would pay and catch up your mortgage, including all the late fees, whether they were true or not, all of the other charges and expenses that the bank had put on, and it's essentially subsidized the bank. And you were not allowed for most of the life of the program to get a modification of your loan, which would have brought the payments down in the future and made it easier to stay in the home. So you get temporary relief to the bank, which in a short term kept people in their home, but in the long term didn't solve the problems that they were facing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also write that the Affordable Care Act was another slap at working families. What was the failure here?
Well, the only people that weren't at the table were the consumers of healthcare. The most important players in the ultimate design of the Affordable Care Act were the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance industry. It became a massive subsidy. It has become a massive subsidy for both industries. And what happened is that most people still who are of working class, who are earning $15 or $10 or $8 an hour, aren't necessarily able to benefit from it, particularly in light of the fact that the expansion of Medicaid was left to the states. So they were left on the cutting room floor there. The only people that were locked in were the very politically powerful pharmaceutical lobby and the insurance industry. And look, we expect our Republican members of Congress to kowtow to those special interests. What I think the last two Democratic presidents have demonstrated to working class Americans is that the Democrats are just as willing to kowtow to the insurance industry, to the pharmaceutical industry, because those are the people that are financing their campaigns. And until we're willing to say no to that, I think it's going to be very difficult to get working class Americans to trust the Party again.
And I guess that's made even more clear with the Affordable Care Act, because that went through without Republican support. So it's not like you can blame anybody else but the Democrats for what we've got.
Look, I was a member of the state legislature before I was Attorney General, and I loved legislating, and I understand the temptation of the art of the deal, the premium that's put in the legislative process on consensus building. The problem is, there were hundreds of insurance and pharmaceutical lobbyists at the table, and there were no lobbyists for working class people. And those that were there, like those in organized labor, they were really focused on preserving the benefits that they had previously negotiated with employers, and not allowing the program to make that a wasted give in their contract negotiations. So there was really nobody in the room on behalf of people at the bottom end, the folks that have been historically, the base of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Marc Dann, who served as Attorney General of the state of Ohio, now leads the Dann Law Firm, which specializes in protecting consumers from various forms of predatory financing. Mark, both Clinton and Obama ran campaigns, as you well know, appealing heavily to the working class and got their support. How do you explain the lack of follow-through?
Well, I think it went to the fundamental priorities of both Clinton and Obama and the people that they appointed. If you appoint a bunch of white shoe criminal lawyers to run the Justice Department, the odds of them going after the pharmaceutical companies that were poisoning Americans with opioids became more and more remote, because in the next administration, Eric Holder went from being Attorney General of the United States back to Covington and Burling, representing insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies in their criminal affairs. So that whole Harvard and East Coast and Ivy League cabal that both Clinton and Obama brought to Washington to run the show simply didn't have any appreciation for how this was being perceived by the people that actually voted for the guy.
Mm-hmm. Now, in another article, you write about Donald Trump as a great con man. Now, of course, you're not going to get a lot of pushback from any of the listeners of this program, but he was able to convince the working class that he will save them from the Democrats who abandoned them. And that's hardly what has happened. Yet he still has support among working class voters. How is he able to pull off, not only just pull it off, but to continue to pull off this scam?
Right. Well, this is where what Leo and I wrote, I think, becomes very practical for Democrats. I think that we have to admit that Donald Trump was right about the problem. The problem is that both Democrats and Republicans in Congress and in state legislatures have abandoned the working class Democratic electorate when it comes to the actual making of public policy. Now, his solution has been worse for working class people. And I think one of the jobs we have in the 2020 election is to explain why that is. That what he's actually done is used the office to make things worse by making the jobs less safe, wages lower, keeping people from being able to have access to clean air and clean water. I mean, across the board, his conduct has been the opposite of what he promised the working class. I mean, ask my friends who worked at the Lordstown plant in Youngstown who no longer have jobs in town, or the folks that worked in the coal mines that have gone bankrupt since Trump became president, or at the steel industry, who I read today is now suffering from very low pricing, and the tariffs are actually working against them. So his solutions are wrong. But the Democrats have to first admit that that Clinton and Obama didn't do it right when it comes to their needs, to the needs of people who work in manufacturing, people who work at the grocery store, people who work in the auto repair shops around the country. And there's still lots and lots of them out there. And it's not a race issue. It's these are people are black, they're white, they're from Hispanic cultures, from they're immigrants from all over the world. Those are the folks that keep getting left on the cutting room floor. So how do the Democratic nominee convince them, one, that because you can't prove to them that you're going to do it right if you don't admit that the predecessors did it wrong.
Agreed. So let's turn to 2020. What is the message, and what are the actions, in fact, that Democrats have to send out if they're to regain the trust of working Americans?
Right. Well, I think some of the candidates have actually started, at least at the presidential level, to act on this. For example, there are several candidates running for president who aren't taking money. It's not just taking money from PACs. It's not going to those $1,000 a person Shaker Heights and Palo Alto and Westchester County and Manhattan fundraisers, where lots of people get bundled by Wall Street power players or bundled by the pharmaceutical industry to give contributions to fund those campaigns. So one demonstrable way to show that you're not in the pocket of these folks is to not take their damn money anymore. And I think some candidates have started to see that not only can they do that, but it's an advantage to them in raising money from individual people. And I've made a point of contributing to those candidates that have taken that position in the 2020 election. And I hope that others who care about the Democratic Party support that effort, because you can't, it's not like the old days where you can take their money and drink their booze and then still vote against them in the morning. The Wall Street and the pharmaceutical industry and the lobbying community is just way too sophisticated, and they're not going to let Democrats get away with that.
And Democrats had a chance to kind of change the tables a couple of different times and especially during President Obama's time and failed to do so. Can they do it now?
They absolutely can do it now. Look, the principles of the Democratic Party, the principles of the New Deal, the idea that government exists to protect people at times in their life that when they need protecting, whether it's from a existential threat, like I can't even say that, like an existential threat like war, or from the threat of not being able to afford your medical bills. I mean, many of the people I see here who, in my law practice, who have fallen behind on their mortgage or who have other issues related to finances, have had one catastrophic event that has been life-changing. God forbid you get sick in America. And the Democratic Party has always been the party that stood for making sure that those folks have what they need in order to not have that your wife's bout with cancer bankrupt you. So we need to return to those roots and put them into a modern context of accessible, affordable health care that doesn't subsidize the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry. I mean, the pricing for pharmaceuticals it literally makes healthcare inaccessible for lots of people that I know, and I don't know as many people as I would like. So there are literally millions of Americans that are hitting that wall every day, and the Democrats need to identify with that, talk about it, and then talk about in terms of very specific solutions. But you can't be saying, "Oh, I'm going to take on the pharmaceutical companies and be cashing their checks in the next room."
Mm-hmm. And we have seen a lot of that, unfortunately. Marc Dann,
unfortunately,
please go ahead.
Sorry. No. I mean, it really is tragic. And look, I think most Democrats I know, and most Democrats who aspire to run for office, would rather not have to kowtow to these folks, to Wall Street and to the pharmaceutical companies. Let's liberate them to do that. And I think not only will that will that make their souls better, but it'll help us elect more Democrats.
All right, Marc Dann, former Attorney General of the state of Ohio, now leading the Dann Law Firm, specializing in protecting consumers from various forms of predatory financing. Marc, appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again and talk some more soon.
I'd do it anytime. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Norman Ornstein tells Bill Press how the GOP became a cult.
You have been a Congress watcher here in Washington for a long time. You and Thomas Mann wrote this great book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. You and I have talked about the book before. As bad as it was then, have you ever seen it as bad as it is today?
I have not seen anything like this, and that long time is 50 years now that I've been immersed in this process.
Whoa.
So we did It's Even Worse Than It Looks in 2012. We followed with a paperback, It's Even Worse Than It Was, 2 years later. Somebody said, what's the next one? I said, it will probably be Run for Your Lives. But of course, those were before Trump. And it's important to emphasize that the rot in the system, the rot of the Republican Party began before Trump. The cultural divisions that we have, the fact that, we emphasized in this book that polarization is a reality, but it's not the real issue. You can solve problems if you're polarized, but it has become tribalism. And a lot of people don't like the term, but I can't find a better one. If you're polarized, you can say, those people on the other side of the aisle, they have terrible ideas, but they're honorable people. We all know what the problems are. Let's see if we can find ways to work together to solve them. Tribal is, they're evil, they're the enemy, they're trying to destroy our way of life. The tribalism, I would argue, began with Newt Gingrich, deliberate tribalism to try and accomplish his goal of getting a Republican majority. It was reinforced with the end of the fairness doctrine. And, I have to say, given what was happening with mass media, it wouldn't have been able to last anyhow. But once that happened and you could get national talk radio and what became tribal media and then social media that have amplified all of this dysfunction, exacerbated by the financial crisis and the populism that emerged with the bailout, the Troubled Assets Relief Program. All of that set the stage for Trump. But what Trump has done is to move us away from every principle of our constitutional system, our democracy, the Republican form of democracy, and created a kleptocracy where enriching yourself, your family, your friends at the expense of the country and even at the expense of its national interest are now everyday occurrences. and has brought us horrific government, a high level of racism and nativism and anti-Semitism. But what's particularly troubling to me is his enablers. That I could not name you a single Republican in the House or Senate who has really drawn a line, a Republican Senate that has done no oversight of the corruption and maladministration that's taken place. We just recently saw a judge confirmed to the Court of Appeals who, among many things, as the general counsel at the Department of Education, drew up a plan to defy a judge's ruling to provide more corruption for private universities, bilking students and then forcing them to repay student loans despite the fact that it was a criminal scheme. A judge who held Betsy DeVos as a consequence in contempt and ordered her to pay a sizable sum of money. This guy who drew up the plan just confirmed. That meant Republican senators almost to a person had to go along. I mean, the fact that they're now defending the indefensible in these hearings and that nobody's raising an objection except for Mitt Romney, who hasn't voted against anything that's significant, is what's particularly unusual and striking.
But that's a question a lot of people have. Looking at the Republicans in Congress, it is its own branch of government. It has, under the Constitution, its own powers. It seems to have totally abandoned its Republicans in Congress, at least, their independence as an independent branch of government to make policy or to disagree with the executive when they can. Why does Trump have this stranglehold, basically, on Republicans, particularly, again, in the Senate, but also in the House?
So let me take it back first. The book that we did that preceded It's Even Worse Than It Looks was The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, 2006. In that book, we hit both parties for failing us, but there was a particular focus on Denny Hastert, then the Speaker of the House, who had succeeded Gingrich in that position.
Right.
And what Hastert did was to act not as an independent branch and Speaker of the entire House, but as a loyal lieutenant to President Bush at the moment. So there's a precedent for this. And of course, we had what was called the Hastert rule. It wasn't exactly a rule, but this notion that we're going to do it all with our own party, and that unless we can get something that will get our own partisans along, we aren't going to reach out to anybody on the other side. But all of it was in concert with doing what the president wanted. That was unusual in every respect. Now bring it forward, and it's much worse. And what I would say...
In Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy.
Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, but every Republican. You had some dissenters back then. You had some Republicans who were furious with Hastert. There were underhanded things done. The rank and file were left out of the loop entirely. The difference, I think, and it's partly an evolution, it's not a party anymore. It's not a traditional political party. It is a cult. Again, that preceded Trump. One of the examples I use often, I was engaged fairly significantly in the campaign finance reform effort that culminated in the bipartisan campaign reform act known as McCain-Feingold. Mm-hmm. The part I played a role in was in what became known as the Snow-Jeffords Amendment, and it was something where Olympia Snowe, then in the Senate, a Republican, called me up because campaign finance reform, which she wanted, was foundering, and she said, we need to find a way where we can do something to curb the impact of corporations, but also on our side of unions that doesn't destroy unions. So I gave her ideas. We wrote a provision. It became a part of the law. It was the main target of Citizens United. And when Citizens United came out as a decision, I had lunch with Olympia, and she was furious. This was an enormous accomplishment for her, probably the single biggest thing in her Senate career, and that they would do this, undoing this act. and doing it in a fashion after Chief Justice Roberts in his confirmation hearings had said, we're going to decide cases narrowly, we're going to follow stare decisis, and then took a case that was brought in a narrow basis and blew it up. All of that. So fast forward, Barack Obama's president, and we get this Disclosure Act called the Disclose Act, passes the House by a wide margin, comes to the Senate. At that point, the Senate had 59 Democrats and 41 Republicans. Every Democrat supports the Disclose Act. It wouldn't undo Citizens United, but it would take the dark money and provide some sunshine. Remember, Mitch McConnell, back when he fought against campaign finance reform, said, I want to see no limits, but we need disclosure, right? What happens to the Disclose Act? It dies because Republicans filibuster it. All 41
could not even get one.
Could not get Olympia Snow or John McCain or any of the Republicans who had voted for campaign reform and voted for these provisions. And that was the beginning, I think, of a cult. And what do I mean when I say it's a cult? We get all this talk, well, Republicans are going along because they're afraid of a primary challenge. True in many cases. Republicans are going along because even if they retire, they're going to want to be lobbyists, they want clients. True in some cases. Not true in, for example, the case of Lamar Alexander. Now, somebody who's had a long and distinguished career, over 80, served as a governor of Tennessee, a secretary of education in the cabinet, a longtime senator. He's not going to run for anything else. He's retiring. He's not going to become a lobbyist, but he's fearful of being shunned, of being viewed as an apostate. So, chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, where are the oversight hearings on the student loan debacles and corruption, on the private school corruption? Where are the hearings on the Department of Health and Human Services bringing in these private prison operations to run the asylum seekers' camps, including the child separation? Nothing. It's the fear of going back and having your entire social group treat you as an apostate. That was true for his longtime colleague Bob Corker in the Senate. It's true, I think, for most of the others. And if you are in a cult, you swallow hard and accept, or you deny the misbehavior of your cult leaders and your colleagues. And so they're going along. And I think, we know from what some say privately, what many Democrats say, their colleagues say privately, that so many of them, especially in the Senate, are appalled by Trump, think he's a buffoon, think he's a danger, but they're not going to step up publicly. And in the House, you have more true believing cult members who really think that he is dear leader.
We have seen Republican and Democratic Senate leaders. I'm thinking of Bob Dole. I'm thinking of George Mitchell, Tom Daschle, Trent Lott, who operated the way you described earlier. It wasn't that long ago that they could sit down and say, here's the problem, how are we going to fix it? And come together. So where do you put Mitch McConnell in that camp?
The context here is I am one of the least favorite people of Mitch McConnell. He has denounced me on the Senate floor. You can see video of him at an AEI meeting on campaign reform, actually, where he denounced me in pretty stark terms. And there's no love lost between us. And in the book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, especially, we go through a reality, I believe, which is that nobody's destroyed the norms of the Senate or undermined the fundamentals of the political process more than Mitch McConnell. And that's true on judicial nominations. It's true more generally in the Senate. It's true misusing the intent of the rules, including the filibuster rule, in ways that we'd never seen before, to block Barack Obama's agenda just because it was Barack Obama's agenda, and then worked overtime to delegitimize and undermine the laws that did get passed. Mitch McConnell is going to go down in history in a very bad way.
One of the principal takeaways, my takeaway from your book, and that's certainly one of the principal points you make, is that the media, speaking about Congress now, they tend to say, well, this side obstructs, but both sides do. Both sides do. Both sides do. That's one thing you, in this book, come out and clearly, it is not, you can't lay the blame on both sides.
So when we wrote this book, and we used the term asymmetric polarization, a little wonky perhaps, but when the book was about to be published, we did an excerpt in the Washington Post Outlook section, and the editor of the section at the time, Carlos Lozada, gave it a title, "Let's Just Say It, the Republicans Are the Problem." And that really went viral. It, moved the book on to the New York Times bestseller list for some time, but it, of course, created a firestorm. And we have a money quote in there about the Republican Party as an insurgent outlier, dismissive and contemptuous of facts, history, and the existing order, and so on. And a lot of my Republican friends, and I had plenty of them in Congress, were furious. This was not the message they wanted. A lot of my friends in journalism were unhappy and uneasy because they had no interest in taking that message, whatever the reality of it. Journalism is inculcated with a set of norms to start with. And one of them, of course, is your job is to report both sides of the story. I had an argument back and forth with one of the veteran reporters at the Washington Post who emailed me that. And I said, your job is to report the truth. And sometimes there are 2 sides of a story. Sometimes there are 12 sides of a story. But sometimes it's very clear where the weight of reality exists. And if a failure to do that, and I had another quote that was used a lot, a balanced treatment of an unbalanced phenomenon is not accuracy. But we continue to see it. And it's not just the norm of we report both sides. It's the fear. And I think, let's face it, a large part of the mainstream media, the reporters and editors over time, were more liberal than the society as a whole. And that had an impact in some cases on how they framed issues, abortion being one. Mm-hmm. It certainly had an impact on the editorial pages. But the idea of being attacked for liberal bias is so painful and makes journalists so fearful that they will bend over triply backwards to avoid it. And those on the right are extraordinarily skillful at making that guilt come out in bigger ways. So I see contortions to try and turn it into both sides. And that was true through the 2016 campaign. It was true through a lot of the reporting on Trump. It's true when you look at CNN, for example, which continues to hire these horrible people who they pay lots of money to and then ultimately have to let go, who are Trump apologists because they want to inoculate themselves by bringing on Trump apologists. They bring on people who lie openly and then bring them back again. It's true when you see now people like Hugh Hewitt, who's become a Trump apologist, as a regular on Meet the Press. And, to me, when I see, as we did just a week or so ago, a panel that consists of 3 journalists who are trying to be objective and balanced, and Hugh Hewitt, that to me is abandoning what journalists, including commentators or talk shows like the Sunday ones, are supposed to do. And so despite the fact that we laid this out here with a whole lot of evidence, and that now at least Trump has gone so far that Chuck Todd is speaking out against outrageous behavior, that we see more of it in blunt terms, including in tweets that reporters are doing, calling out. That you have on CNN people like Jake Tapper, who are pretty blunt, that even you have good reporters like Chris Wallace on Fox, that you even have, as we just saw, Brett Baer, as he watched Donald Trump live tweeting, sliming Ambassador Yovanovitch, saying, criticizing him and saying this is another article of impeachment in the making. It's still there and it's not going away. And it's a pernicious danger to the Republic. What I find so astonishing about it is it's going to destroy the free press if they don't move back to fighting for news and facts.
Bill Press talking with Norman Ornstein. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sarah Jaffee, Marc Dann, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.